Welcome to LexTalks Legal Topics Simplified,
Yeah.
where we make the law accessible to you students. And today, we are diving deep into climate change.
Sure.
You know, the concept, the international efforts, and the UNFCCC curated just for you, our law students in India.
That's right.
You guys sent us a ton of sources,
Yeah,
and we're here to, boil it all down into what you really need to know.
absolutely.
It's a complicated world,
It is.
but we're going to make sure that you understand the most, intriguing parts.
For sure, for sure. It's like a puzzle,
Yeah.
a constantly changing puzzle.
Yeah, okay. So let's start putting those pieces together. First things first, climate change 101.
Yeah.
What is the core concept here?
So imagine the Earth is wearing a giant invisible blanket.
Okay.
That's the atmosphere, right? And it's filled with gases. And some of these gases we call greenhouse gases. And these gases trap heat from the sun, like a greenhouse keeping the planet warm enough for us to live. But here's the thing. Since the Industrial Revolution, human activities like burning fossil fuels and deforestation have been pumping way more of these greenhouse gases into the atmosphere.
So it's like we're adding extra layers to that blanket
Exactly.
and making the planet warmer.
Exactly. You got it.
Okay.
And that extra warmth, even if it seems small, can cause huge changes. We're talking melting glaciers, rising sea levels, and even more intense weather events like cyclones and droughts.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, or IPCC for short, they're like the leading group of climate scientists. Okay. They say that the Earth's temperature has already increased by about 0.85 degrees Celsius since the late 1800s.
Which doesn't sound like a lot, but we're already seeing the effects.
Yeah.
So what happens if we don't slow this warming down?
Well, the IPCC has projected that if we continue on our current path, we could see a 2 degrees Celsius increase in global temperatures by the end of the century.
Wow.
To put that in perspective, imagine the Sundarbans home to the Royal Bengal tiger.
Yeah.
A 2 degrees Celsius increase could submerge huge portions of this unique ecosystem, displace communities, and threaten endangered species.
Oh, my God.
And what's even more concerning is that even if we stopped all emissions today, many of these changes would continue for centuries. It's like trying to stop a giant ship.
Yeah.
It takes time and a lot of effort.
Wow. Okay, so this is where I start to feel a little overwhelmed.
Yeah.
So what are we doing on a global scale to address this? This is where the UNFCCC comes in, right?
Right, you got it. The UNFCCC, or the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, is the foundation of global efforts to tackle climate change. It's like the constitution for international climate action.
So it sets the ground rules for how countries work together to address this massive challenge.
Precisely. Think of it as a giant global agreement where countries come together to negotiate how to reduce emissions, adapt to climate change, and support each other in this effort.
And this is where things get complicated, right?
Yeah.
Because we have developed nations who historically emitted the most greenhouse gases, and then developing nations like India who are still growing and have different needs and priorities.
Exactly. It's like trying to balance a scale with different weights on each side. The UNFCCC recognizes that developed nations have a greater responsibility to lead the way in reducing emissions. They're also expected to help developing countries financially and with technology transfer.
But isn't it a bit unfair to expect developing countries who are still trying to catch up economically to shoulder the same burden as developed nations?
That's a key point of contention in climate negotiations. Developing nations argue that they have the right to develop and improve their living standards. They say that developed nations should provide more support because they're the ones who caused most of the problem in the first place.
So it's a constant back and forth between these two groups, trying to find a solution that works for everyone.
Absolutely. And this plays out in various ways within the UNFCCC framework. Take the Adaptation Committee, for example. It's a body specifically created to help countries figure out how to adapt to the impacts of climate change that are already happening or are unavoidable. This committee is particularly relevant for India, given its vulnerability to climate change impacts like rising sea levels and extreme heat.
So there's a recognition that even if we drastically cut emissions, we still need to prepare for the changes that are already locked in.
Precisely. It's about building resilience, whether that means developing drought-resistant crops, protecting coastal communities from sea level rise, or improving early warning systems for extreme weather events.
It sounds like the UNFCCC is trying to address both sides of the coin, reducing emissions and adapting to the impacts that are already here. But how does this translate into concrete actions? Are there specific agreements or mechanisms within the UNFCCC that guide these efforts?
That's where things get even more interesting. The UNFCCC has led to several key agreements, but the most well-known are the Kyoto Protocol and the Paris Agreement.
Ugh. Huh, the Paris Agreement. I've heard so much about it, but I'm still not entirely clear on what makes it so significant.
Well, think of the Paris Agreement as a landmark achievement in international climate diplomacy. For the first time, it brought all countries together under a legally binding agreement to combat climate change.
So no more finger pointing or passing the buck.
Right.
Everyone has to participate.
In principle, yes. Each country under the Paris Agreement submits its own national climate action plan outlining their commitments to reduce emissions and adapt to climate change. These plans are called Nationally Determined Contributions, or NDCs. It's a bottom-up approach where each country decides its own level of ambition based on its national circumstances.
Sounds like a massive global group project.
It is.
But how do we ensure that everyone is actually doing their part?
That's a key question and a major challenge. The Paris Agreement relies heavily on transparency and accountability. Countries are expected to regularly report on their progress, and there are mechanisms for review and assessment. However, it's important to note that the agreement lacks strong enforcement mechanisms. It relies more on international pressure and peer review to encourage compliance.
Okay, so maybe not a perfect system, but it sounds like a step in the right direction. But what about the financial aspect? We talked about developed nations supporting developing nations. How does that actually work?
That's where climate finance comes into play. The UNFCCC has a dedicated financial mechanism to channel funds from developed countries to developing countries to support their climate actions.
So is there like a giant global piggy bank for climate change?
Well, not quite a piggy bank, but there is the Green Climate Fund, which is specifically designed to support developing nations in both reducing emissions and adapting to climate change.
So countries contribute to this fund, and then developing nations can access these funds for their climate projects?
Exactly. It could be for things like investing in renewable energy, building seawalls to protect coastal communities, or developing early warning systems for extreme weather events. But like many things in the UNFCCC, there are constant debates about how much money should be contributed, who should contribute, and how these funds should be allocated and used.
It sounds like navigating the world of the UNFCCC is like walking a tightrope with constant negotiations and complexities. But it seems like a crucial framework for global climate action, especially for countries like India.
You hit the nail on the head, and understanding these complexities is vital for you as future legal professionals in India. Because climate change is not just an environmental issue, it will impact laws and regulations related to everything from energy and infrastructure to agriculture and disaster management. And that's where India's role becomes particularly fascinating. As a rapidly developing nation with a large population and ambitious economic goals, India faces a unique set of challenges and opportunities when it comes to climate action.
Right, we talked about the tension between developed and developing nations. India's position kind of exemplifies that, right?
Absolutely. India is committed to the Paris Agreement, but it also emphasizes its right to development. India argues that developed nations who have already gone through their industrialization phase should shoulder a greater burden in reducing emissions.
Mm-hmm.
They also say that developed nations need to provide more financial and technological support to help developing countries transition to cleaner energy sources and adapt to climate change.
Okay, so it's a delicate balancing act for India, aiming for economic growth while also tackling climate change.
Yeah.
But let's zoom in on adaptation. How is India approaching this challenge?
Adaptation is crucial for India, given its vulnerability to climate change impacts. We're talking about a country with a vast coastline prone to rising sea levels regions, facing water scarcity, and a large population dependent on agriculture, which is highly sensitive to changing weather patterns.
So what are some examples of adaptation strategies being implemented or explored in India?
Think about agriculture, for instance. Climate change is already affecting crop yields and water availability, so India is focusing on developing drought-resistant crop varieties, promoting water conservation techniques like rainwater harvesting and improving irrigation efficiency. It's about making agriculture more resilient to the changing climate.
That makes sense. And what about coastal areas? Rising sea levels are a major concern, right?
Definitely, coastal communities are extremely vulnerable. India's adaptation measures include building seawalls, restoring coastal ecosystems like mangroves that act as natural buffers, and developing early warning systems for cyclones and storm surges.
So it's a mix of like hard engineering solutions and working with nature to protect coastal communities. But adaptation isn't just about infrastructure, is it? It's about people's lives and livelihoods.
You're absolutely right. Imagine a situation where sea level rise threatens to submerge low-lying coastal villages. Relocation might become necessary.
Oh, wow.
But that raises complex issues like land rights compensation and community resettlement. These are legal and social challenges that need careful consideration.
That brings up an important point. As future lawyers, How can we contribute to adaptation efforts in India?
Climate change will touch upon nearly every aspect of law, from environmental regulations and land use planning to disaster risk management and even human rights. Understanding these connections and developing legal frameworks that support effective adaptation strategies will be crucial.
It sounds like climate change is creating a whole new field of law.
It really is. For example, water scarcity is another pressing issue in India. As climate change alters rainfall patterns and intensifies droughts, we'll need legal frameworks that ensure equitable and sustainable water management. This could involve updating water rights laws, promoting water conservation, and finding ways to resolve water conflicts between different users.
It's like climate change is throwing us a curveball, and
Yeah.
we need to adapt our legal systems to catch it.
Right.
Are there any other areas where the law can play a key role in adaptation?
Think about urban areas. As cities grow and become denser, they become more vulnerable to heat waves, which are projected to become more frequent and intense due to climate change. Developing urban planning regulations that promote green spaces, improve building design for better ventilation, and establish early warning systems for heat waves. These are all areas where law and policy can make a difference.
Okay, I'm starting to see how climate change is intertwined with so many different aspects of our lives and our legal system. But how does India translate these adaptation needs into concrete actions on the ground?
That's where policy and governance come into play. India has a National Action Plan on Climate Change, which outlines a comprehensive framework for adaptation. It covers everything from agriculture and water resources to coastal management and disaster preparedness.
So it's like a blueprint for how India plans to adapt to climate change.
Exactly. But the real challenge lies in implementation. Turning these plans into tangible actions on the ground requires coordination across different government agencies, effective resource allocation, and most importantly, community involvement.
It sounds like a massive undertaking. Are there any specific examples of adaptation initiatives in India that are actually working?
There are definitely some inspiring examples. In Odisha, a state highly vulnerable to cyclones, the government has implemented an incredibly effective early warning system and disaster preparedness program. This has significantly reduced the impact of recent cyclones, saving countless lives.
That's amazing. It shows that we can take concrete steps to adapt and protect ourselves. Are there any other success stories?
In Gujarat, communities are reviving traditional water harvesting techniques, adapting ancestral knowledge to cope with current water scarcity. And in cities like Bengaluru, there's a growing movement to promote urban forestry and green spaces, not just for beautification, but also to mitigate the urban heat island effect.
It's encouraging to hear about these local solutions, but adaptation isn't just a national issue. What about international cooperation? How can India benefit from global efforts to support adaptation?
That's where the UNFCCC and other international mechanisms come into play. Remember the Paris Agreement. It specifically emphasizes the importance of adaptation and calls for enhanced support for developing countries. This includes financial assistance, technology transfer, and capacity building.
So is this support actually materializing? Is India getting the help it needs?
There are some positive developments. The Green Climate Fund, which we discussed earlier, has been allocating resources for adaptation projects in developing countries, including India. But to be honest, there's still a long way to go. The scale of the challenge is enormous, and it requires significantly greater financial commitments from developed nations.
Right, it all comes back to that principle of common but differentiated responsibilities.
Exactly. Climate change is a shared challenge, and while all countries need to contribute, developed nations have a moral and historical responsibility to support developing nations in adapting to impacts they disproportionately contributed to.
So we've covered a lot about adaptation, but we touched upon loss and damage earlier.
Cool.
What exactly does this mean, and why is it such a sensitive issue?
Yeah, loss and damage. It's
Yeah.
one of the most complex and sensitive aspects of climate change. It acknowledges that some climate impacts are simply too severe or irreversible for adaptation to fully address.
Okay.
It's about the losses and damages that occur despite our best efforts to mitigate and adapt.
So it's about acknowledging that there are limits to what we can adapt to.
Exactly. Think back to the example of the Sundarbans. Even with adaptation measures, if sea levels rise beyond a certain point, some areas might become uninhabitable, leading to loss of land livelihoods and even cultural heritage.
Wow, it's a stark reminder that climate change has real consequences for people's lives. We can't just engineer or adapt our way out of every problem.
You're right. And loss and damage can take many forms. It's not just about physical damage to infrastructure or economic losses.
Right.
It also includes things like the displacement of communities, the loss of biodiversity, and the destruction of cultural heritage sites.
So it encompasses the intangible losses as well, the things that are hard to quantify, but are incredibly valuable to communities and cultures.
Precisely. How do you put a price tag on the loss of a traditional way of life that's been passed down through generations? Or the disappearance of a species that's unique to a particular region? These are the complexities that make loss and damage such a challenging issue.
It sounds like this goes beyond science and economics, touching upon ethical and moral questions of justice and responsibility.
Absolutely. And this is where things get politically charged. Developing nations argue that developed nations who have historically contributed the most to greenhouse gas emissions should provide financial assistance to address loss and damage in vulnerable countries.
That makes sense. If developed nations bear a greater responsibility for causing climate change, shouldn't they also help those who are suffering the most from its impacts?
That's the argument being made. But developed nations are often hesitant to accept any kind of liability or open-ended financial commitments. They prefer to focus on mitigation and adaptation, sometimes viewing loss and damage as a separate and potentially limitless financial burden.
So it's another point of tension in the global climate negotiations, highlighting the disparities between developed and developing nations.
Exactly. It gets to the heart of climate justice. Who bears the costs of climate change, and who has the responsibility to help those who are most affected?
Okay, it seems like there's no easy solution here. What are some potential ways forward? How can we address loss and damage in a way that's both fair and practical?
Well, one approach is to focus on practical solutions, rather than getting bogged down in legal debates about liability and compensation.
Oh.
This could involve strengthening disaster preparedness and risk reduction measures, developing insurance mechanisms to help communities cope with climate-related losses, and providing technical and financial assistance for post-disaster recovery and rehabilitation.
So it's about finding ways to help vulnerable countries cope with loss and damage, even without necessarily establishing formal liability or compensation mechanisms.
Exactly. It's about demonstrating solidarity and providing support in practical ways. There are also discussions about setting up a dedicated fund for loss and damage, potentially drawing on sources like carbon taxes or levies on fossil fuel extraction.
That sounds promising, but I imagine getting all countries to agree on such a mechanism would be a huge political challenge.
It definitely would be. But the scale and urgency of the climate crisis demand bold and innovative solutions. Ignoring loss and damage is not an option. It's a matter of justice, equity, and human dignity.
Well said. So, as aspiring lawyers in India, what can we take away from this deep dive into climate change, the UNFCCC, and the complexities of loss and damage?
The key takeaway is that climate change is not just an environmental issue. It's a multifaceted challenge that intersects with every aspect of our lives, including the law. As future legal professionals, you have a crucial role to play in shaping the legal and policy frameworks that will determine how India adapts to climate change, mitigates its impacts, and addresses the issue of loss and damage.
Wow, it's a call to action for all of us to engage with this issue, understand the complexities, and contribute to finding solutions.
Absolutely. And remember, this is not just about protecting the environment. It's about protecting people's livelihoods and future generations.
Well, thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into climate change and the UNFCCC. It's such a complex and ever-evolving issue, but we hope this conversation has helped shed some light on the key concepts and challenges. For you, our listeners, especially our law students in India, we encourage you to continue exploring this topic and consider how you can contribute to solutions as future legal professionals. Thanks for listening, and don't forget to subscribe to LexTalks for more deep dives into legal topics that matter.